Hello again. In this video, we're going to talk about the CSS Box Model, which is how the dimensions of an element are determined when the browser loads a web page. To do this video, we're going to create a sample file. So you can right-click on your CSS folder here and choose New File. And let's just call it CSS Box Model.html, like that. Okay, and then put in the starter code that we've been using. So type in HTML and choose the one that says 5. I suppose we should continue to indent our code properly like we have been. So we're going to indent the head and the body elements so that we can clearly see they are children nested within the HTML element. You can update the title to say CSS Box Model. Okay, and now we're going to put a few elements inside the body so we have something to work with here. Let's go ahead and add a div and like this. So type in div and hit enter, and then we can just make it say sample div. And then we need a paragraph that has a span inside of it. So on the next line down, type in P and hit enter, and then split those P tags apart. And then let's make it say, this is a sentence with a span element in it. Okay. Now we need a span element. What we'll do is we'll wrap this content span element inside of a span element. That's kind of confusing, but we need to put an opening span tag here. And then we need to move the closing span tag to over here. Okay, kind of confusing, but there we have a span element within that line. Okay, you're probably wondering what we're doing here, but hopefully it'll become apparent soon. We need one more div on the page. Let's put it underneath the paragraph here. So type in div and hit enter, and then let's give this one an ID of some div, some dash div, like that, and we'll see this one later in the video. Okay, so those are the elements that we're going to work with here. Now we're going to apply some CSS code to it. So let's move up to the head element, and right underneath the title element, let's add a style element. So type in style and hit enter right there, and then hit enter again to split the style tags apart. And now we can get started. Okay, what we're going to do here is we're going to create a group selector that targets both divs and spans. So the selector is going to look like this: div, comma, span, and then our curly braces. Okay, so we're targeting both div elements and span elements with this rule set here. All right, let's set the background color to light gray for our first rule inside that rule set. So background color, dark gray, like so. And now let's take a look at this page in the browser here. So Control S to save it, and then you can do Alt B to open it in the browser. Mine came up over here in my other browser, and here's what the page should look like. So what we've got here is a div, which is a block level element, and then we have a span, which is an inline element. So you can see how that span falls in line. Okay, and now you can't see that last div because there's nothing inside of it, but we'll see something inside of it later in the video. Okay, so here's what we're working with: a block level element, div, and a span, which is an inline element. So I want you to see the way these two elements behave differently here. Okay, back over in VS Code. Let's go ahead and get into our rule set right here. And what we'll do is we'll set the height and width of here in the rule set. So we want to set the height property to 200 pixels, 200 px, like that. And then we'll set the width to 300 px, like that. Okay, now interesting, let's see what happens here when we reload the page. So if I do Control S and then Alt Tab back to the browser here, and then reload the page, now we can see the other div right here. We'll be playing with this later, but look at what happened to the span element. it's not respecting the height and width that we just set on it. But the block level elements are. So the takeaway here is that if you try to set the height and the width on an inline element, like the span one, they will be ignored. Okay, just something to be aware of in CSS. All right, let's Alt-Tab back to VS Code here, and let's continue to add rules to our rule set. If you want to put a border around an element, you can do it like so. I'm going to put a blank line here just to kind of separate these rules because we're going to have a lot of them by the end of this video. But there's 3 things that you need to specify in order to add a border around an element. You have to specify the width of the border, the color of the border, and the style of the border. So we can do it like this. We can set the border width property, and let's just set that to 4px, like so. And then you can set the border color property. So border color, we'll set it to red, like so. And then you can also set the border style. I'll show you what the border style is, you might be wondering. But border dash style, like that. And then I'll just set it to solid. Okay, let's see what that looks like right now. Control S to save it. Alt tab back to the browser. Hit refresh. And now you can see that all of the elements have a 4-pixel red border around it. And we chose a style of solid. So there are some other styles you could choose. Let's just try one here. I don't know that I've ever used them, but there's dashed. You could set this to dashed. So if I save that and then refresh the page, you get a different style for your border here. Okay, so you can apply border to block elements and inline elements, and they will work. Okay, there's a shortcut for applying border. What you can do instead of those 3 lines that we just typed, you can take care of it all in one line just by setting the border property. So if you type in border colon, and now we can set it to, let's do this, 2px solid, I don't know, yellow. Okay, now this is going to override what we put here because it's coming after these 3 lines of code. We could comment these out. I guess we'll just leave them here. But anyways, here's a shortcut. You can specify all 3 things required to set the border just by setting the border property. And then you just put a space in between each one of those. And the order doesn't matter. So I could have set this to border colon solid yellow 2px. So it doesn't matter what order you put these in. Okay, go ahead and save that, and then Alt tab back to the browser and hit refresh, and now we should have a thinner yellow solid border here. Okay, so that's a good shortcut. I don't think any programmers would take the time to type all this. They would all do this because apparently programmers are lazy and want to do as little typing as possible. Okay, if you wanted to target just one side of the border, what you could do here is you could let's choose the top side. So we'll set border top width. We'll set that to 5 pixels. Okay, so we want all the other borders to be 2 pixels, but the top to be 5. So here you can say border top width and then set it to 5 pixels. Save that, refresh it in the browser here, and you can see that the top border is thicker than the rest. Okay, so that's how you can deal with border. And also when sizing these elements here, you also can work with margin. Now margin is going to be the white space that appears around the outside of an element here. So let's go ahead and do this. Now I could do margin top, margin right, margin bottom, but if I want to set all sides the same here, I can just set the margin property like so, and let's just set it to 30 pixels. Okay, so I could do margin top, margin left, margin right, and set them all to different sizes. But if you want them all to be the same, just set the margin property like we did here, another shortcut. So save that, Alt tab back to the browser, hit refresh here, and now you can see, now this is interesting, you can see that we have the white space of 30 pixels around these elements, and it's hard to tell from looking at this, but there is our inline element. It's getting the margin on the sides, but it's not getting it on the top and bottom. Now, so that's another interesting thing to note is inline elements will not respect top and bottom margin, but they will respect the margin on the sides. CSS is quirky, and this is one of those quirks. But anyways, I suppose it might make sense because if you have the margin on the top and bottom, it could mess things up when your lines start to wrap. So that's probably the reason why. Now, if I wanted to just set the top, here's another shortcut for margin here. If I wanted to, I could do this 30px and 10px. If you have two numbers here, what it's going to do is set the top and bottom margin with the first number and then the sides with the second number. Another shortcut right there. We don't need to worry too much about this here, but that'll the first number is for the top and bottom. The second number is for the sides. If I added two more numbers, I'll just go 5px and 2px, okay, like so. Now, the way this would work is you start at the top. If there's four numbers, you can start at the top and go clockwise. So this would be top, and then that would be right, that would be bottom, and that would be the margin on the left. Okay, another shortcut rather than having to specify margin top, margin right, margin bottom, and margin left. Okay, don't worry about that too much. Okay, we can also apply padding. So padding is a little bit different than margin because that's going to be inside the box. So the margin that we set over here, that's a white space around the outside of the box. But let's see what happens when we set the padding. So here, I'll go ahead and add a rule to set the padding property, and let's just set it to, I don't know, 30px. Okay, so that's going to be the padding all the way around. Go ahead and save that, and then Alt-Tab back to the browser and hit refresh, and there you go. Now here's the padding. You can see it here. There's 30 pixels of padding on the inside of the box. So the margin is outside the box. The padding is inside the box. Okay, now this is interesting. Look at the overlap happening right here. Now, earlier we saw that if you try to set margin on an inline element, it will only do it for the sides and not the top and bottom. But the way padding works is it goes all the way around these inline elements. So very strange, this behavior of CSS. You don't have to worry about this too much for this course, but if you're going to really dig deep into CSS, you might need to be aware of these strange quirks. And another quirk here is this overlap that's happening here. I believe that's actually a bug in CSS. So the span here is overlapping our div, which is above it. Now, before we summarize this box model for CSS, I want to talk about one more property here. Let's go ahead and go back to our code here, and let's set the display property. Like this. Let's set it to block for now. Okay. All right. So we've been talking about block and inline elements, and you can change their behavior. So this is going to make our span. It's going to turn it into a block level element. The divs are already block level elements, so it wouldn't affect them here. But if I save this and Alt-Tab back to the browser, there we go, and refresh. Now this is hard to see here, but there we go. Our span element is now occupying an entire line as if it were a block element. In fact, what we did is we turned it into a block element. Okay, let's go ahead and change that to inline here. So you can override the default display of an element, which is either a block or inline, or we'll see a mixture here in a second here. Go ahead and set those to inline like that. Control S to save it. Alt-Tab back to the browser, hit refresh, and now all three elements are, it's hard to see because of all the margin and padding we've added here, but they're all falling in line right now, even though the layout's really blown up here. Now, here's one that's actually handy, is you can make an element display as a hybrid between a block and an inline element. So change this value here from inline to inline block like so. You can see there's a few other you can choose from here. We're not going to get into these, but we will try this inline block one right here. Okay, save that, and then Alt Tab back to the browser and hit refresh. And now here's what happened. Remember way back in the beginning of the video when we tried to set the height and width and they were ignored by our inline element? Well, if an element is inline block, it will actually respect the height and width that you set for it. So there are cases when this comes in handy where you want elements to stay in line. That means that they will fall in place in a line, but you do want to set the height and width. So the inline block display setting will allow you to do that. And that does come in handy, and we'll probably be using it once we get to the final project. But note that this isn't behaving like a true block level element because it's still in line. It's not occupying its own line. It's falling within our sentence here. Okay, so now we can summarize the CSS box model. Here in VS Code, well, I guess I can show you in the browser here. The true height and width that an element is going to occupy is going to be a combination of the width that you set it, the border that you add to it, the margin that's around it, and the padding that's inside of it. So you have to add up all those numbers to figure out the true space on a page that an element takes up. Now that can be confusing here. Let's go ahead and target that div that we put on the bottom of the page. So if I scroll down here, we have this div right here, and we added this ID to it. So let's go ahead and target that div. So let's add a rule set. Now we want to put this after the one rule set that we've been working in here, and it's going to use an ID selector, and it's going to be sum-div. So I got hashtag sum-div and then my curly braces here. Now let's go ahead and set the width to 150 px. Don't forget that semicolon. Let's set the height to 75 px. I guess we're not really worried about height, but I'll set it anyways. And then I'll set the padding to 10 px. And the margin to 20 px. And let's just, I think that'll do it for now. Okay, so can you figure out what the true dimensions of this div are? We're going to ignore the height, but for the width, let's just focus on the width here. So it's going to be 150 pixels plus 10 pixels times 2. So we're putting, the width is going to be padding on both sides. So that's actually adding 20 pixels of width right here. The margin, we're actually adding 40 pixels of width because there's 20 pixels on each side. So what is that? 150 plus 20 is 170 plus 40 is 210. So that's going to be the true width of our element, and that's what the CSS box model is. Okay, let's just take a look at this real quick. I'm saving it and then going back to the browser, and that div is down here. So here you go, you can see our margin. There's nothing inside of it, so it's hard to see the padding, but there's what our div looks like right now. Now, the box model has confused a lot of developers, and it can really cause problems when you're trying to lay out a page, because let's say I want to make sure that my page takes up 1,000 pixels. So I might create a sidebar that has 700 pixels, a main content area that has 700 pixels and a sidebar that's 300 pixels. And so I can do my math, nice and neat. 700 and 300 makes 1,000. But then I decide I want to add some padding or some margin or a border, and that blows up the layout. So you would have to recalculate your width based on the margin and padding that you want. And now this really drove developers nuts. So at some point they came out with a new property that can allow you to get around this problem, and it's called the box sizing property. So if we go ahead and go to this div right here, or this rule set right here, and we set the box sizing property to border box. This is kind of strange, but what this will do is it will allow you to set the width, and that's what the width will be. So it will calculate whatever padding and border you specify. Okay, now it doesn't account for margin. Usually that's okay. We don't usually care about the margin so much. But so in this case, you'll see here, I'm going to save this and then Alt tab back to the browser. And now when I refresh the page, watch, this is going to shrink a bit here. So if I refresh, that got a little bit smaller. And that's because we set the width to 150 pixels. Okay, so what it did is it made the width 150 pixels, and it calculated the padding, and if we had border, it would calculate that into it too here. So this box sizing property is nice because you can go ahead and apply border and padding to an element and then not have to worry about recalculating the true width. So this is just a good little trick to know about. Actually, to demo this better, I want to go back and look at our HTML folder here that we did a while back, and remember what we did with our layout elements HTML file. I actually slipped this in here. Where was it? I set the border sizing to box. I'm going to go ahead and open this page in the browser real quick. And here's what we have here. So we have our main content area and our sidebar. Now look at what happens if well, let's take a look at the code here first. So the main element is 70%. The aside is 30%, so those two numbers match up perfectly to 100%, which is what we wanted here. But things would get out of whack when we applied the padding here. So in this case, both of them, the main and the aside, have a padding of 20 pixels. So that means that the true width of this is going to be 70% plus 20 pixels on each side. And then this is going to be 30% plus the 20 pixels on each side. In other words, it would blow up our layout. So I slipped this in here without explaining it to you guys back then. I'm going to go ahead and comment out that box sizing property with Control // that'll comment out that line. And then if I save my changes here and refresh the page, you can see the layout got all out of whack. And that's because the main content is 70%, and the aside, which got moved down to here, is 30%. But because of the padding, they no longer fit within the 100% because the total is greater than 100% because of the padding. So that box sizing property is really handy. You don't have to worry about adding borders and padding and then recalculating the width to make sure that everything fits. Okay, that'll do it for this video.